It's the third hour of the Elias Makos show. Now, it is official. July was the hottest month on record globally. We saw the heat waves in Europe, by the way, in July. You know, and I feel kind of lucky. I was in Greece in June, and we had just the most perfect, best weather. I think it was like slightly below normal in Greece, at least. And then in Europe in July, boy, you just saw the temperature soar. Now, July's average temperature globally was 16.9 Celsius. That broke a 1992 record. The question now is how we adapt to this new reality. And Alexandra Lesnikowski joins us on the line from the Concordia Climate Change Adaptation Lab. Alexandra, welcome to the show.
Good morning, Elias. Happy to be here.
And let me just put my cards on the table. I hate talking about these subjects here because I find now more and more when I talk about climate, I've got to deal, like on social media and with our listeners on the text line, I've got to deal with two new realities, right? I've got to deal with climate deniers, right? And let me just put it on the table. Climate change is real. Climate change is caused by man. I'm on that team, okay? So I've got the climate deniers that I have to deal with. And now more and more, I also have to deal with climate doomers, where everyone's going to die, nobody have any kids, what's the point? Let's just end it for all of us. And I'm sort of stuck in the middle here, okay? So I'm so happy to talk to you because I know what we want to talk about here is adaptation, adapting to a new reality here. So what are some of the issues that cities will face because of, these rising temperatures, and how do we adapt to them?
Yeah, so this is an excellent and very timely question. As you led off with, what we've seen is that July was the warmest month on record. It's followed a period between about 2015 and 2020, which was, again, the warmest 8 years on record. There's this consistent, decade over decade warming trend that we're seeing now, and this is directly as a consequence of increasing concentrations of greenhouse gas emissions that humans are emitting through various different pathways. So, what we're seeing now is the consequence of that, which is, growing issues with things like flooding, storm events, extreme heat, that are making it increasingly challenging to live in the cities that we designed essentially for, a climate that no longer exists around us. Mm-hmm. So now alongside this conversation of, how we decarbonize our society to avoid further climate change, we're also talking more and more about how we adapt to these changing risks around us.
Yeah.
So here in Montreal this summer, we've seen, a snapshot of what this looks like. We've seen the flooding that's affected places like NDG during extreme rainfall events. We've seen storms, including things like tornadoes, which, that was the first for me, here in Montreal experiencing that. We're seeing more frequent and more severe heat waves. So this is now the other, as we say, pillar of climate policy. How do we adapt to, the impacts of the changing climate? And increasingly, cities are looking at multi-pronged approaches to dealing with these different types of risks. So doing things to improve, the health of our natural environments, like our tree canopies, to help us modulate things like temperatures, as well as updating how we actually build our infrastructure, our homes, and other types of buildings to make them more suitable to these changing climatic extremes.
And haven't we been successful at that? You mentioned the decade over decade increase in temperatures, and we've got the evidence of that. And then we can also look at the decade over decade, like look at the last 100 years. Every decade, and the deaths from natural disasters, those have dropped. Decade over decade over decade, we have crop yields we're doing a great job. Like humanity we're so amazing at finding solutions, right? Because crop yields at a time where we have massive population growth, we've been managing it. In fact, we're producing more food than ever. So, how do we do it? We seem to be doing a pretty good job at managing those risks. So do you have any silver linings here? Do you have an approach here where you say, hey, we're actually doing what you're asking for when it comes to mitigating those risks?
Well, the issue is that climate change runs the risk of undoing a lot of the progress that we've made over the past, especially century, with things like, adequate food production to support our growing population. A lot of the, what were once projected consequences of climate change are only really now just starting to manifest around us. So we expect that these types of impacts like, extreme heat and flooding are actually going to worsen and accelerate as we go forward. Now, on the sort of silver lining side, as you've pointed to, there are a lot of different tools that we have available to us to start trying to cope, with these emerging or growing risks. So for example, we can update our building codes, we can update our infrastructure standards so that they're better able to cope with, for example, higher volumes of rainfall events. So for example, our stormwater systems, can better absorb all of the rainfall we saw, for example, in July, which flooded out, the Turcotte Exchange, for example, the Carry here in Montreal. Mm-hmm. We have a lot of modeling that shows how things like urban greening or the addition of things like, shade awnings can help to cool our streets and bring down the temperatures in our neighborhoods. So there are lots of different kind of individual interventions that we can do to tackle these risks. And overall, what really needs to happen now is sort of scaling up those types of interventions so that, we're adapting across, the whole island of Montreal, not just in little pockets. And we're thinking about how to tackle future climate risk when we're building new infrastructure, when we're building, new neighborhoods, for example, as our governments are now setting out to do to tackle our housing affordability issues. So what we're looking now to see is first of all, a scaling up of funding. So that we can do things like update aging infrastructure systems to better cope with climate change, and also develop sort of long-term strategies and long-term plans for how we're going to tackle future changes in our climate system. So Montreal, for example, has a climate plan now, and it does have some adaptation elements in it. But what adaptation scholars like myself would like to see now are dedicated adaptation plans that really think very long-term up through, 2050, for example, about how we update things like infrastructure systems as our climate changes. So the province of Quebec, for example, is now also pushing all municipalities to develop those types of long-term plans over the coming years. So it's very likely that we're going to see cities like Montreal starting to more kind of strategically think about how to tackle adaptation.
And adaptation, is this the only way forward? Because I'm thinking about the billions of people that want to have a lifestyle and a standard of living like we do in North America or in Europe. And, I feel like if I get to live this incredible lifestyle, and have all of use all of this energy, I feel like, I guess, everyone else gets to deserve that same standard of lifestyle in the world, right? So if we have to deal with that reality, is adaptation the only way forward?
So adaptation is really important for trying to do things like protect human health, human well-being, economic productivity in a changing climate. But in order to adapt, the other essential component of this is that we need to decarbonize as quickly as possible. So what we're seeing right now is that climate change impacts can be pretty catastrophic, even at relatively low levels of global warming. So we really do not want to experience climate change that gets a lot worse than what we're already experiencing. There are very likely limits to how much we can adapt to. So we know that, currently we do not have adequately ambitious emissions reduction pledges from countries to set us on that decarbonization path, and we're not currently on track, even with current pledges, to accomplish that goal. So, this piece of decarbonizing, of eliminating our greenhouse gas emissions is really going to be essential for enabling effective adaptation and ensuring that, our communities can stay safe and that we can continue to thrive as our climate changes. Is
there anything that encourages you? I look at the percentage of energy or hydroelectricity or electricity that's being provided now from green sources in parts of the world. The numbers like from the UK, from Texas of all places, from other parts of Canada, those numbers are going up. And some would say it's an exponential growth in getting our energy from green sources. Does that provide you, as you mentioned, we got to get to decarbonization. Does that provide you with hope? If certain countries are missing out on their targets, does what's happening in the energy sector provide you with some hope?
Yes, it absolutely does. I think that we are absolutely in the midst of an energy transition right now. We are, move towards, for example, a decarbonized electricity production system. And now the challenge is really to speed up the pace of that transition so that we can meet our targets in the timeline that climate science shows we need to meet them in order to avoid, the worst impacts of climate change. But if we look, even just over the past 10 years at how far we've come in the conversation and the policy landscape around climate change, both in terms of, reducing our emissions and also adapting to the impacts, we've seen a really tremendous shift happen in, the sort of mainstreaming of this issue. Despite the fact that, of course, yes, there's still, climate deniers out there. This has become a mainstream and accepted political issue and policy issue. So we're starting to see, the traction is there. And now really the challenge is to scale up the pace of all of, these efforts that we're seeing emerge.
Alexandra, I have to leave it there. I want to thank you for the discussion. Maybe we can catch up again real soon.
Thanks so much for having me.
That is Alexandra Lesnikowski from Concordia University and their Climate Change Adaptation Lab.